Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of All For You. This will be Part 12, Day 21. Day 21, 29 weeks. Buttoning up his suit was a familiar, comforting motion, even if his suit from the Bakugos was a little different than he was used to. Hisashi brushed his hands over the fabric, admiring the quality stitching. It was a good suit. Sure, some of his Italian ones were better, but he was also willing to bet they cost significantly more than the Bakugo brand line. Hisashi sighed, looking at himself in the mirror of Izuku's hospital room. He had cleaned up well. He was infinitely grateful Masaru had remembered to bring his razor. It would have been embarrassing to walk into this meeting with unsightly stubble still on his face, a meeting he still fervently wished he didn't have to go to. Beyond the obvious reason of not wanting to leave Izuku's side, especially when there was no one else to pick up his watch, it irritated him to no end that he had been caught in such a vulnerable position like this, by such an idiotic mistake, no less. It should have been avoided. He should have been able to keep both his baby and his empire. Izuku should have been to term. Inko shouldn't have died. But life wasn't fair, so he had to do what he must. He was sure Yoichi was laughing beyond the grave. The villains always lose, indeed. He sighed, switched off the light, and walked out of the bathroom to see Izuku one more time before he left for the next few hours. "I'll be back soon, Izuku," Hisashi whispered, laying a gentle hand on the incubator. Izuku shifted quietly in his sleep, but otherwise didn't respond. Hisashi sighed again, looking up at the new piece of equipment next to his son. It was called a pacifier-activated lullaby device, or PAL device. It was an extremely cheesy name, in his humble opinion, but its purpose seemed incredibly useful. It encouraged Izuku to work on his suckle's strength and endurance by motivating him to use the pacifier with the sound of either him singing or Inko's voicemail. He wished he could have had a better recording of Inko, but, well, it wasn't like they'd had many options available. He had been rather embarrassed when he realized he had to record his almost certainly subpar singing for it, but to be quite honest, it was the main reason he felt comfortable enough to leave for this farce of a meeting. When the recording of him played, Izuku would have no reason to think he was gone. It would be as if Hisashi had never left. He checked his phone. If he didn't get a move on, he was going to be late. That wouldn't do. Hisashi pulled his hand away. He hated this, but if it meant he got to keep Izuku by his side, it was worth it. All for One left the room to meet the heroes and discuss his retirement. All for One met Ito just outside of the NICU, where she handed him a cup of black coffee and led him through the winding halls of the hospital to a rather unassuming conference room. "Ready?" she asked, looking back at him. All for One snorted. "As ready as I'll ever be." "Fair enough," Ito said with a tight grin, and opened the door. All for One's eyes roamed the room quickly, taking note of who was there. All Might for One, who looked just as enthused to be here as he was. Nezu, of course, paws folded and beady black eyes watching him with interest. Sir Night-Eye, who seemed more preoccupied with his laptop than anything else. There were 3 people in suits, 2 women, 1 man, who were likely HPSC pawns. It was unfortunate that he didn't recognize any of them. It would have been nice to have someone in his pocket here. And of course, he and Ito were here as well. He supposed he could consider Ito in his pocket, though it would be more accurate to say she was in Izuku's non-existent pocket, seeing as she was here as an advocate for him, not All for One. "Welcome," Nezu said cheerfully, waving a paw at them. Ito nodded, but All for One did not deign to give a response except to seat himself. "Now that we all are here, let's make a quick declaration of intent, shall we?" Nezu said, clapping his paws together. No one replied except to stare at the chimera. Nezu's smile only widened. "We are here to negotiate the terms of surrender, for lack of a better word, of All for One." "Not surrender," All for One corrected. All Might whipped around to glare at him, eyes narrowed. All for One grinned at him. "A mutual agreement to the cessation of villainous activity in exchange for being left in peace with my son." All Might snarled, his hands clenched into fists. Sir Night-Eye stared at him, slowly pushing up his glasses. The HPSC goons whispered among themselves. All for One barely refrained from laughing. Oh, it was so easy to wind these heroes up. How could he resist? Ito let out a long sigh next to him. "It's all the same. We're just trying to come to an agreement." "Yes," Nezu said, smiling. "Let's not waste time. All for One." Nezu gestured toward him. "Since you were the one to propose this initial agreement, You can state your terms first. Oh, All for One purred. So I can just tell you what I want, and you'll give it to me? How generous. All Might snarled, standing up at the table. That's not how negotiations work. All for One raised an eyebrow, looking up at All Might. I was simply asking a question. No need to be so disruptive now, All Might. Disruptive? All Might hissed. The only one being disruptive here is you. Are you even taking this seriously? Of course I am, All for One said, testing how far his chair would lean back without the wheels lifting off the ground. No, you aren't, All Might snapped. Don't tell me how I feel, All Might, All for One said, looking up. That's rather rude and presumptive, don't you think? Terms, All for One of the HPSC representatives called out, her voice tinged with exasperation. Let's stay on topic. I was not the one that derailed us, but very well, All for One said, leaning back in the chair and crossing his legs. He hummed thoughtfully, tapping a finger against his chin. Terms. Well, I want full custody of Izuku, obviously. Other than that, All for One locked his eyes with All Might and grinned. I would like to keep my fortune, full use of my quirks if necessary, and because I know you lot will want some form of punishment, house arrest at my wife's apartment. All Might seethed. All for One leaned back, his grin widening. Yes, that sounds good to me. You just want to get off scot-free, All Might hissed. All for One shrugged. I will be busy with Izuku, you know. Thank you for giving clear terms, Nezu said, clapping his paws to get their attention. His beady eyes gleamed in delight. The Chimera was clearly enjoying this game, regardless of, or perhaps because of, the stakes it held for all involved. Now it is our turn. Once we understand where we all stand, we can begin moving toward an agreement that benefits us all. Sir Night-Eye, if you will. All for One let out a long sigh, his grin falling. As fun as it was to rile All Might up, it could not last. An anxious stone already sat in his gut, which he was dutifully ignoring. It was hard, nigh impossible, to think of Izuku as just another game piece, but that was what he had to do to remain in control, to whittle the heroes down to something reasonable, to arrange things so that they would have to work their way up to his demands rather than the other way around. It was time to play, and he was at a distinct disadvantage in these negotiations. A novel experience, to be sure, but not one he was particularly enjoying, and the meeting had barely started. Sir Night-Eye cleared his throat, glancing up at All for One. All for One took a sip of his coffee. It was all right, for hospital coffee. Yes, Sir Night-Eye said. The following terms were decided as a starting point by the Board of Heroes and approved by the HPSC, and are as follows. A locked-down, high-security location under constant monitoring. No quirk usage. Relinquishment of all criminal information and blood money. All for One hummed, displeased, as he swirled the coffee in his cup. He could not particularly say he was surprised by the heroes' terms. He knew who he was, and what he had aimed to do, what he had aimed to become. Truly, part of him was pleased that they required such extensive measures to feel safe from him, even as he stepped down. Still, anger simmered in his gut. When you say a locked-down, high-security location under constant monitoring, I assume you mean Tartarus? All for One asked. Ito sat up straighter by his side, feathers puffing up slightly. Good, she was picking up what he had put together. Yes, one of the HPSC representatives said. It would be the only safe place to keep someone like you. All for One's lips curled, his eyes narrowing. And are you so certain Tartarus is a suitable place for a child to grow up? He asked scathingly. I'm sure your highest-level prison is well known for its preschool education. All Might and Sir Night-Eye shifted uncomfortably. Good. The child's situation is on a shifting basis, and the circumstances for education will be decided at a later date, once any relevant health conditions are ascertained, and if they survive to that point, the representative said. All for One's nostrils flared, but he held his tongue. Izuku would make it to that point. He would make sure of it. If he could. He had to. Absolutely not, Ito said from his side, her beak clicking angrily. A prison is no place for a child to grow up. The patient would have no access to outside, no access to peers, and no chance of a normal or happy life. A child needs a home, not a prison cell. A custom room can be arranged, as can access to peers, the outdoors, and normal civilian life, one of the representatives replied. It's not ideal for the child, but... It is not ideal is an understatement, Ito rebuked. The whole idea is preposterous. Nezu clapped his paws, bringing an end to the bickering. If a custom room can be arranged, then I'm certain a customized facility that extends the standards for child care while still being high security can be arranged by our wonderful HPSC, can it not? I would hope so, All for One rumbled. The only reason I'm even considering retirement, as it was put, is to be with Izuku full time. His eyes narrowed, a sharp edge rising to his voice. If you try to keep us in Tartarus, I will not be so agreeable to your next attempt at negotiating. Sir Night-Eye cleared his throat. Threatening us is not really helping your case. I'm perfectly aware of what I am doing, All for One stated. But you're not leaving me much of a choice. I'd thought the safety and well-being of a child would be more important to you lot. All for One leaned back, propping his head up on a fist as he looked at each of the heroes in turn. Unless, of course, the quality of life of my child does not matter, as he is my blood, and your primary objective is to get me in a prison cell. Silence fell. The HPSC representative blinked at him coldly, All for One's lip curled. No, All Might said. All for One glanced over at him, raising an eyebrow. That's not the case, All Might said, blue eyes glaring at him. We do care about Izuku. Both of All for One's eyebrows rose. Good to know you meet the bare minimum, All for One said. Like you're one to talk, All Might snapped, and All for One rolled his eyes. All Might growled. Do you know how much suffering you've... Nezu clapped his paws, quieting All Might's ranting. It seems the HPSC and the team representing the potential sponsor need time to discuss our terms once more, Nezu said cheerfully. He looked rather triumphant, if his twitching tail and grin were anything to go by. We shall meet again the day after next. Have a good day, everyone. Until next time, All for One said, standing up and grabbing his coffee. He met All Might's eyes. Do better. All Might snarled, and All for One made his exit. You started out your terms rather high, Midoriya-san, Ito said as they left. All for One chuckled dryly. Well, of course. It's only logical to start higher than what is actually possible, so that the compromise terms consist of what I actually want. Ito looked at him out of the corner of her eye. And what do you actually want? Hisashi smiled softly, looking back at her. I don't want him to be limited by who I am. That's all. Hisashi sighed with relief as he closed the door to Izuku's room behind him, finally back where he wanted to be. He never thought he'd miss the sound of heart monitors so much. Hello, Midoriya-san, Aoi said cheerfully from Izuku's bedside. Oh, hello, Aoi, Hisashi said tiredly, taking off his jacket as he walked over to look at Izuku. Izuku was on his side, buried underneath a small mound of blankets, as he rested. How has he been? Good, Aoi said, only to be interrupted by the sound of Hisashi singing. He cringed slightly, but still eagerly looked down at Izuku to watch him suckle on the pacifier. Aoi giggled as Inko's voicemail played, then his singing again, then the voicemail again, then his singing again, before the audio mercifully stopped. He's been asleep most of the day, but he woke up not long ago. He's been going in rounds of 5, as frequently as he can, Aoi explained with a grin. We've been hearing it a lot. I apologize for my singing, Hisashi mumbled, and Aoi laughed outright. Trust me, Midoriya-san, you are far from the worst singer I've heard, and besides, she pointed out with a wink as she seemingly began to wrap up whatever she was doing. It's not playing for me, it's playing for Izuku, and he seems to be a big fan of yours. I would hope so, Hisashi said, even as he felt his cheeks warm slightly. I'm going to turn off the PAL since you're here now. Let me know if you need anything, all right? You know where to find me, Aoi said as she walked out of the room, and Hisashi nodded. Finally, the door closed, and it was just him and Izuku. Izuku peered at him, suckling on his pacifier. Hisashi chuckled, propping his elbow against the arm of his recliner and resting his head in his hands. You want me to talk to you, Izuku suckled more. Hisashi laughed. Your wish is my command, my little ray of sunshine. Now let's see. Talking about what I've been up to is good enough, isn't it? Yes, let's start there. Something you should know, Izuku, is that I was a bit naughty before you were born, so I've been working very hard with a group of people that call themselves heroes. Izuku had fallen asleep after a good while of listening to Hisashi ramble. He didn't mind. After all, it sounded like he had only lightly rested while Hisashi had been at his meeting, what with all that activity with the PAL device. Izuku was still now, in one of the deepest sleeps he had been in so far. It was a little unnerving to see him so still, but the sound of his monitors and the sight of his little chest rising and falling were a balm to his anxiety. Hisashi sighed, looking down at his hands as he fiddled with his phone. He wanted to call Inko. Aoi had stopped in to take Izuku's weight, and he was finally over 1 kilogram. He wanted to share the good news. But Inko was dead. He knew she was dead. He saw the life leave her eyes, and death had been his constant companion long enough for him to recognize it. Even if this one was one of the few times, he was the one that kept calling their name, even after they were gone. He didn't know why he kept calling. Well, part of it might be that he wanted to hear her voice. Her voicemail was all he really had of her. He'd never been one to watch life through a camera, and before Inko he simply hadn't had much worth recording for personal sentiment. Once he did have Inko, he hadn't wanted her or the budding family to get caught in the crosshairs of his business. Any mementos or recordings he had of her were on different devices, still back at the apartment she had loved so much, but even those were scarce. It had seemed impossible that one day she might not be there. Foolish. But that didn't explain why he kept leaving messages for a dead woman. Hisashi sighed and dialed her number. There was no point in trying to figure it out now. He had enough on his plate. He listened to her voicemail with a small smile and began to speak. All right, listeners, this concludes day 21 of All For You. I hope you all are still enjoying, and as always, thank you so much for listening.